I have the honor and the duty of introducing Professor Pavlo-Роберт Маґочій to you. Perhaps this is not really necessary. I think that all of you probably know him and have read some of his books or articles. Professor Maγκocsi is really one of the most important historians of, in a time when there was no real free research in Soviet Ukraine, Professor Maγκocsi was the first and still only, I think, chair of Ukrainian studies at the University of Toronto starting from 1980, I think, which of course was part of the project of trying to build an academy of sciences outside Soviet Ukraine in order to study Ukrainian culture. And it was perhaps just a few years after the fall of the Soviet Union, I'm not sure, perhaps a little later, but nevertheless, well, the history of Ukraine that Professor Maγκocsi wrote is one of the best and one of the most known throughout the world, and was revolutionary in a way, because we all very often talk about it, the problem of taking the modern nation state as the base on which you reconstruct a millennial history of a territory, of course, is something challenging. And the solution that Professor Maγκocsi found of presenting a multinational history of those territories was something really revolutionary in the way historians look at the history of today's Ukraine, but he was also very well known because he one of those who studied for the first time the Russian nationality, and for very useful atlases of Ukraine. So I think that if you have never seen these pieces of works, I mean, I suggest you look for them, because they are really, really, really good and interesting, and in a way provoked a real development in the historical studies of Ukraine. But here together today are for presenting or discussing three different books that Natalia already mentioned: the history of Jews and Ukrainians, a millennium of coexistence, the book a collection of essays, Babin Yar, History and Memory, and a more, let's say, shorter book, L'Ucraina ritrovata, Ucraina Redux. And of course, I mean, the first thing that you would like to ask when you are presented with not one, not two, but even three books is that, of course, you think there is a project behind them. There is a sort of, I mean, this is not just like a normal scholar who is writing, doing a research, writing a book, publishing it, and then of course trying to, but also because these books were created in collaboration with the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter. This is like a cultural project and a political project that, in a way, I mean, I think was initiated by the very famous book edited by Potichny, the Ukrainian Jewish relationship, of rediscussing, problematizing the relationship between the Ukrainians and Jews throughout Ukrainian history. So I'm asking you this question because, in a way, you are talking with colleagues here. So we are perhaps interested in having, listening from you. What was your plan when you, were you planning like this already from the beginning, of more books on these topics, and why you decided to, from a certain moment on, to dedicate yourself to studying the history of Jews and their relationship and their meaning for Ukrainian history, perhaps also a little bit the other way around, like Ukrainians and their meaning in Jewish history. I know that this is not a comfortable question perhaps at the beginning, but please.
Totally comfortable question, because it gives me an opportunity to respond in the most general way. So I guess there are, would say, two principles from which most of my career derives, and then how these publications actually fit within it. First of all, being a child of Herder, for me, the most important thing are individual cultures. And every culture in the world has its own value and is equal to any other culture. Some political entities were built, as we call them in modern times, states, associating themselves with some cultures. But what is often lost in the educational process in general is that everyone thinks in terms of states and not peoples. And it doesn't make a difference where you are in the world, because all educational systems, for all intents and purposes, always teach little kids about countries. They never teach them about peoples. Whereas, if we take a very simple proposition that there are 5,500, 6,000 different languages and therefore cultures in the world, well, there have never been more than 200 states at any time. Well, what does this mean? This means that the vast majority, or virtually every state, and if we just speak of Europe, every state is multinational. Everyone. Maybe not Ireland, and maybe not Iceland. But even Germany, and even right here in Italy. I spent a lot of time with the Piemontese, and the movement of the Piemontese to associate themselves with a distinct culture. And of course we have Friulane, and we have Ladino. We won't get into Siciliani, that's a different story. But people do not necessarily think in these terms. So, when we are stuck with having to think in terms of states, and that's our educational system is that way, my argument has always been that if you are writing a narrative history of a particular state, some would say we don't even need kind of narrative histories, the long-term history, but states exist, one should give attention to every specific culture within those states. Why? Because everyone, each individual has a right to their own voice. Just because a state was created and included them within it, we all well know that states come and go, but peoples remain. And so I had always taken the approach, regardless of what country I was writing about, it could be Slovakia, it could be, in this case, Ukraine, to make sure that my history, as I always would joke, the big history, which is not on the table here, but was alluded to, is actually that history that appeared first in 1996 and then was revised in 2010, different editions in Ukrainian, 2 editions in Ukrainian, edition in Polish. It was actually the first history of Ukraine. And people would look at me and say, what would you be pretentious here? Well, actually, in many ways it was, because up until that time, we have had numerous histories of Ukraine. Popular 1-volume histories. From Grushevsky, Krypyakevich, Doroshenko, Sutelny, etc. And even still today, some of my colleagues like Pochy Tries to do a little bit because it came after this history, but they actually weren't histories of Ukraine. They were all histories of the Ukrainian people. And these are two different subjects. Ethnic Ukrainians is one thing, of the state, which is now called Ukraine, is another. And so, one of the elements is my overall concern with all of the peoples who comprise any particular territory, and to give them their voice, so that they feel when they go to, little kids go to school, right? And they're reading, let's take the case of Ukraine, the great Ukrainian heroes, whether it's Khmelnytsky or Shevchenko, or if you're of Polish background and you're living in the right bank and your grandfathers over the war, about the Poles who contributed so much to the history of Ukraine. They too should have a voice, let alone Crimean Tatars. We can go on and on and on. And in that context, then we have one of the peoples exceedingly important. In that first history of Ukraine, was one of the largest amount of attention given to Jews, because they are an integral part of the history of Ukraine. You can't understand history of Ukraine unless you understand the history of Jews, as well as Poles, as well as Russians, but ethnic Russians, by the way, and not always as enemies. I mean, we think of these as a kind of the bad people. No, they're not the bad people. They're part of this world, and have always been part of this world, and in some cases still are. So in that context, then, one of those peoples were Jews. So now how did we get to this? It was easy for me because it's just another one of those peoples, all of whom deserve attention, alongside ethnic Ukrainians. And you will note, by the way, in any conversation that I have, I will always use the term ethnic Ukrainian. And that's important to do that. You know why? Because everyone in Ukraine, regardless of their ethnic background, is Ukrainian. Everybody. But there are those who are ethnic Ukrainian, and there are Crimean Tatars. Crimean Tatars are also Ukrainians. And the Poles who live in Ukraine are also Ukrainians. And the Magyars who live in Ukraine are also Ukrainians. Right? But there are, so to single out or to distinguish those who are ethnic, that's why I use that term a lot. So now if we get to Jews, how did this happen? Well, this happened because the organization that you just heard about was created, I don't know, 2010, something, 2008, somewhere around there. I'm a historian, so I don't remember any dates.
Classic.
They're all relatively irrelevant, except one or two you have to remember. When it was created, I was contacted early on, even before the organization came into being, because of my general interest. And so I became part of this organization. And in, I got this date right, 2016 was the celebration, was a commemoration, not celebration, commemoration coming up of the 75th anniversary of Babin Yar. And Babin Yar in the West was generally little or unknown. I mean, everyone knows about the Holocaust and Auschwitz. Babin Yar, well, what's that? And who cares? So, the organization decided that something should be done, since the organization is talking about an encounter between Jews and Ukrainians, to help the government, which had no plans at the time, to commemorate the 75th anniversary of Babin Yar. And when they say they had no plans at the time, because in order to do that properly, we started 2 years in advance. We started in 2014, making plans for a grandiose, 1 week long commemoration. And in the context of that 1 week long commemoration, we decided because there was various components. There was a component for youth, there was a component for scholars, there's a component, international competition run by the International Association of Architects in Paris, was the overall body, for how to commemorate Babin Yar. So several architects.
If I may interrupt you, perhaps can you add something more? Because actually Babin Yar is perhaps one of the most contested sites of memory for Ukraine and for this history. So perhaps if you can tell, I don't know if the Italian audience know everything about how problematic actually telling about Babin Yar nowadays is,
sure.
even before the war and with the war even more. So
exactly.
if you can...
Sure, and I will. And I'm just going to finish my point and then I'll answer that question. And that for that commemoration, we decided to do 2 books. And the 2 books were Jews and Ukrainians, which if you ask me about, we will look at too, and Babin Yar. And for the Babin Yar book, well, I'll leave that. That's how we got to this. Okay. So the first edition of Jews and Ukrainians came out in English and Ukrainian in 2016. And the first kind of, this is the scholarly edition, first kind of edition of Babin Yar came out also at that time. So every participant, and there were about 500 participants in this week-long event, got a copy of Babin Yar in English or Ukrainian, and a copy of Jews and Ukrainians in English or Ukrainian. Now, in answer to this other question that you had, in many ways, commemorating any historical or serious historical event is problematic and laden with controversy. I mean, whether you're building a monument to the Vietnam veterans in Washington, D.C., or replacing the World Trade Center, it takes forever. Sooner or later, somebody steps in and says, this is the way it's going to be, and that's it. And then sometimes you put up a monument, as you did in Washington, D.C., for the Vietnamese veterans. The monument that won the award was by some Japanese young lady that didn't, there's just names, so it didn't fulfill the idea of some grand. So they built another monument, so there are 2. We don't have 2 replacements for the World Trade Center for the moment. But Babin Yar, in that sense, is very typical, and also one remembers Babin Yar, not to say that there haven't been tragic events associated already before the war, certainly during those 4 years of the war, and then after the war, but really it becomes known simply for those 2 days in September 29th, 30th, when upwards of 38,000 exclusively Jews were murdered, and that is what really made Babin Yar infamous. Clearly, we're not going to say famous. And however, Babin Yar was not necessarily forgotten after the war under Soviet rule, but there was next to no emphasis placed on Jews. So, just like the Holodomor or the Great Famine was totally forgotten in the Soviet Union, Babin Yar wasn't forgotten, but it was just a tragedy of Soviet citizens, when actually, in this particular case, as we well know. And so there was nothing really done, and then I think sometime in 1970, all this is discussed in great detail in this book. The first monument was put up, which again was in 3 languages, and one of them was, I can't remember now whether it was Yiddish, which I would have favored, or Hebrew. But again, no reference to Jews per se. And then after and there were dissidents, including Ivan Zuba, certainly Yevtushenko with his famous poem, Shostakovich, who wrote his 13th Symphony. So there were efforts to commemorate it, but it was nothing public, nothing large scale, well under the radar in a sense, because the Soviets weren't particularly interested in memorializing this. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the creation of the Ukrainian state, where more or less everything was possible, more or less. So then you had everyone coming out of the woodwork. So yeah, the Orthodox started putting up some commemorative markers because several Orthodox priests were killed. The Roma put up. So you had this. World Jewish organizations were interested in doing something major, if not quite like Auschwitz, at least a museum. So there were plans for this. All of these efforts effectively came to naught, and we still have a problem today in which ground has not been broken for anything. Even though in 2016 we had this international competition for architectural design, that's what landscape design. And why? Because as with many commemorations or memorializations, different bodies, different individuals have varying understandings of what should be done. One very small thing. This was a burial ground, which means it's a sacred place. You shouldn't even be walking on it. It's a necropolis, which is actually the way we defined it, because you had to create some outline for this international competition. But others want to build grandiose museums or do various things on this necropolis. So there's just one example of the controversy as to what should go there, let alone who should be paying for this, and that's another story.
Well, also because, I mean, what makes Babin Yar particularly important in the history of Jews and Ukrainians together is that, and by the way, we haven't mentioned that this book, Jews and Ukrainians, has been written by Professor Maγκocій, of course, but also by another historian, one of the best historians of Jews in Ukraine, Johann Petrovsky-Stepp, and who has done a study, and I agree with them, that it was exactly the commemoration by Ukrainian dissidents made from the 1960s that in a way brought together these two different streams of Soviet dissidents in a new alliance, I would say, against the Soviet Union, who was repressing both of them. I mean, even Zuba makes some very explicit speech about a very explicit speech about it. And so this has something to do also with what Babin Yar represents today in Ukraine. I mean, there is, in my opinion, two different let's say, schools there, those who are trying to build, making Babin Yar a sort of memorial of the whole, of all the nations of Ukraine. If you think of the fact that on the territory of Babin Yar there is a memorial about the gypsies that were, or the workers,
prisoners of war, Soviet prisoners of war.
And there is, I mean, another part of the Jewish community, and also of the scholars who are afraid that perhaps using Babin Yar in that way is somehow contributing to a main narrative of memory that is somehow forgetting that was mainly a Jewish tragedy and something that concerned, I mean, that the Jews more than others, I mean, coming from the Soviet Union, where there was no possibility of telling that the people who died there. So, and when I read this book, and I want to say this book is really an incredibly good book. It's enough to look at the names of the authors of the essays, who are perhaps the main experts of each individual. I'm always unable to find the table of contents, but I mean, you have Mikhailo Kalnitsky, Karel Berkov, Vladislav Grinevich was also the co-editor, Grinchenko, so they are really the best historians in Ukraine or around the world who studied Babi Yar. And some of the names that you have here, these are people who actually decided not to be in the committee, like who was working on the project of the memorial, because this is a very contested thing. I mean, what they are doing with the memory of Babi Yar. So, well, you said that this book was designed or imagined when? Before perhaps the
2014.
2014.
We sat
well,
down and did the well, because we had to have something by 2016 and something serious.
Okay.
It was conceived in 2014, and it was conceived in a, you've alluded to it, but well, some of you have seen it already. It was conceived as not just to focus on what took place during those 2 days in September 1941, but rather, of course, the rest of the war as well, but rather what was Babi Yar before? I mean, Babi Yar had a history before, and then most importantly, we added into something that I remember the Romanian national historian Nicolae Iorga he wrote a book called Byzance après Byzance, and that was to look at the heritage of the Byzantine Empire long after it didn't exist anymore, but primarily, though not exclusively, in the Balkans. And so similarly, we had Babi Yar before Babi Yar, and then Babi Yar après Babi Yar. That is how Babi Yar has been treated. So there are separate chapters here on oral history, on interviews, belles-lettres, cinema, music, painting and sculpture, because Babi Yar, like Byzance, had a life after it. And also, there are several chapters in here on the whole problem of commemoration, which you started to ask, because it's a very complicated matter, made even more complicated by the intervention of money. You know, money always speaks, because who's going to pay for this commemoration? The Ukrainian state? The Ukrainian state has never had enough money to pay for anything. So it welcomed with open arms external forces. To make a long story short, as is outlined very clearly in the last essay, which actually I wrote, which deals with the problem of commemoration after 2016, in which you have powerful oligarchic forces whose members were born in Ukraine but lived, acted, and all their money is based in Russia, which doesn't help matters. One of the leading figures who was behind the project to commemorate and build museums, etc., was and still is in the inner circle of Putin. This causes a bit of a problem, as you can imagine. And that then alienated some of the, as you alluded to, some of the members that participated in this project. This project has them all, by the way. But some of them that participated in this project didn't want to have anything to do with it because the President Poroshenko requested the Institute of History of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences to put forth their proposal of how to commemorate. So in the end, we had, and theoretically still have, a Russian project and a Ukrainian project for commemorating Babyn Yar. Well, because of circumstances that began in 1914, so I got my dates right, except 100 years old. Events that began in 2014 and then continued in 2022, there's nothing going on. And who knows when anything will actually happen on the territory of Babyn Yar, whether one project or the other.
As you mentioned it before, I mean, the thematic approach to this problem is one of the constant traits of these two books. I mean, when I couldn't think of writing a history of millenniums of relationship between Jews and Ukraine, but this is a choice that you did also for this book, and it is one of the most interesting things that you are. You were somehow. Why did you decide to do that instead of using chronological approach? Because of course there is some sort of chronological, but you have, like, you decided to do economic life, religion, music, and so on.
Absolutely good question, and it's good for, among professional scholars here. This comes, first of all, this is not a history of Jews, number one. It is a book about Jews and their interaction with ethnic Ukrainians. But where does that approach come from? I spent a lot of time both at Harvard when I was there in the 1970s and then subsequently in Toronto. It was one of the areas that I worked in which not many people know about is the history of immigration to the United States. So I was on the editorial board and a major author, the author of 7 entries in the Harvard Encyclopedia of American Ethnic Groups. And then when I came to Toronto, within 10 years I was made a director of an institute that specialized in the history of immigration or immigrant cultures in Canada. And since I was the director of the Institute, I made the major project of the Institute during the 1990s, an encyclopedia of Canada's peoples. So it was a major encyclopedia, 1,500 pages, large format, 120 different peoples, going back to the fact that every country is made up of different peoples and different cultures. And dealing with all of these authors, whether with the Harvard Encyclopedia or the Canadian Encyclopedia, we took what we called the pseudo-sociological approach. Namely, that we weren't writing chronological histories of each of these peoples. We were looking at various aspects of their existence, in which the historical background is kind of almost minimal. And so, what were the themes? Well, the migration process, the settlement process, economic life, organizational life, religion, etc., etc. And so that model that we used for those two encyclopedias, the Harvard Encyclopedia and the Canadian Encyclopedia, we then applied here. So that what is important to know from our perspective is the economic life of these people, their culture, their religion, folklore, music, as you see, painting, art, architecture, etc. And the result actually, and some of you have seen this book already, this is the first general this is the first general overview in English of Ukrainians and their homeland. Actually, we also have chapters on the diaspora. So if someone wants to know about various aspects of Ukrainian culture, literature, they can go in here and just flip through those chapters. And the other thing we did here was design the text in such a way that someone who's interested in, let's say, Jews in particular, and goes through here and looks for whatever aspect of Jewish existence, well, they have to read about ethnic Ukrainians as well. And similarly, if you just want to know something about ethnic Ukrainians, well, you got to find out about the Jews as well. So this was done somewhat deliberately, because it is about these two peoples.
Listen, also for within the attempt of including also the third books in the discussion, if you think of the importance of Jews in the creation of the Ukrainian state, very contemporary history is a turning point. I mean, if you look at the importance of President Zelensky in representing a new, as for example, our colleague Gritzak defined as a new middle class of Ukraine. I mean, the famous speech of the Tut, my Tut, Minister, Tut, and so, and that really makes the difference. So I was thinking, what is the contribution, the specific contribution of the interaction between Ukrainians and Jews in the creation of the somehow new concept, if you find any, of the new civic state. Nation,
yeah.
civic state in Ukraine that is
yeah.
like treated in this book.
You mentioned President Zelensky, Yermak, even before they were in power, other people of Jewish background who found posts at the highest level of Ukraine, and for that matter, Crimean, Tatar, etc. My observation may be a bit different, but there is Zelensky before the second phase of the war and Zelensky after. And there is also Ukraine before and Ukraine after, inevitably. Ukraine and Ukrainian society was already, even in late Soviet times, on a very healthy path in which most people were not concerned with their ethnic background or who they were or the language they spoke. The level of intermarriage between ethnic Ukrainians and ethnic Russians or people of Polish background, or these things didn't matter, really. They matter more in the diaspora when you're outside of the country than when you're in the country. And in the case of Zelensky, again, very healthily, he ran for president of the country. I don't remember people talking about, during the campaign, his Jewish background, except maybe once in a while someone would make some offhand comment. But he didn't present himself as Jewish, not at all. This was already a civic society in the making, or you were identifying with your state and not your particular background. Now, after the second phase of the war, Was it people within Ukraine who were saying, oh, look, we have a Jewish president? Actually, no. It was people outside of Ukraine, whether it's the Ukrainian diaspora, saying, look, what a liberal country we come from, what a liberal people we are, because the president of our country has a Jewish background. So, you know, he became more Jew, it became the thing to be, because it plays into, very important, how he, and therefore Ukraine, will be accepted in the outside world. And certainly as part of countering the Russian propaganda message that we've been hearing from the very beginning, this is a Nazi state, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So now we have a Jewish president, but we didn't have a Jewish president before 2022, I might say.
Okay. Listen, this Ukrainian Redux is sort of a pamphlet, it's something with a very, like say, very strong civic meaning in it.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I mean also the fact that it's been translating into so many languages,
right,
is because this is a sort of similar project to the one of the other two, but in a way a little different. Can you say a little more about the say circumstances in which you decided to write this book, and what was your
okay
task?
So this little book or pamphlet is something very specific. One of the things that is a magical word in international politics is The Hague. You mentioned The Hague. Oh, well, that's where the International Court of Justice is, the International Criminal Court, the European Court, we can go on and on and on. Well, in the year 2016 or 2017, the Ukrainian government made a decision to take the Russian Federation to the International Court of Justice. And let me make one thing clear here. I know you're Europeans, you should know this. Most people don't know this. And they mix things up. So there is the International Court of Justice that goes back to the League of Nations after World War I. In the 20s and 30s, it was known as the World Court. And then after World War II, it became the official court of the United Nations. And all members of the United Nations are automatically, and in fact choose justices, for the International Court of Justice. Much later, maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, don't know, something else was created, or created itself, also based in The Hague, called the International Criminal Court. These are two separate things. And it's the International Criminal Court, of course, that brought Milosevic and all of the Serbian and Bosnian characters to court. It wasn't the International Court of Justice. And it's the International Criminal Court that has, you know, accused Putin of crimes and so forth and so on, and made him, quote unquote, an outlaw. So these are two separate things. The Ukraine brought a suit against the Russian Federation over Crimea. And there were two reasons. One had to do with financing and using that as a base for international criminal finance. And the other was violation of human rights of ethnic Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars. They engaged a well-known international law firm in Washington, D.C., and that law firm, like any law firm, engaged expert witnesses. And I was the expert witness for the Ukrainian side, dealing with those issues of violation of human rights of ethnic Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars. sorry it's a bit long, but it's contextual. So I wrote the expert witness report. It was about 45 pages. And by the way, as scholars, if you ever have to do this, it's a new world. You don't do what you want to do and the way you want to do it. You're given a task, and then you write something, and it's back and forth and changing and this and that. It's actually a very demanding exercise. You learn a lot, by the way. And they know what they're doing, these people, let me tell you. So, in any case, the first expert report is a long process. This process took 4 years. First expert report, the Russian Federation has a year and a half to respond. They engage their experts. And in this particular case, they engaged the entire Academy of Sciences of Ethnography, the Russian Academy of Sciences. 5 people wrote a 100-page report, single-spaced. And of course, you know, criticized, actually the content, not so much, but the interpretation of my report. So this went back and forth. Then Ukraine had an opportunity to respond to the Russian, and they decided that they wanted another report and asked if I would do a second expert report, but this time not about Crimea, but responding to the Russian charges. And what were the Russian charges in this 100-page report? Well, that basically, you know, Ukraine is not really a state. It came into being only in 1991. It's only because the Soviet Union had carved out this administrative entity. This, you know, this is not really a serious state. And then the other thing, Ukrainian, what is that? Well, that's just a nominal identity. You know, most people don't take it seriously, etc. And then, you know, mixing up language. Most of people who are ethnic Ukrainians speak Russian. You know, all of this kind of standard position of the Russian position, and unfortunately gobbled up by many people in the West, who are gullible and are already sympathetic to the greatness of Russia through the centuries. And so I was there specifically to address those questions. That is the question of statehood and national identity. And that's what I did in this second report. And then a friend of mine who saw the second report after it was published said, you know, this is great. This is what one needs right now. A quick statement, because there's all kinds of, as we know, since 2022, hundreds and thousands of articles, commentary, this, that. Quick, what, who, what is the Ukrainian state if it exists? Who are these people? So he said, I'd like to publish this. So he took my second expert report, it's mentioned in here. I had to clean up all of the things that you do for the court, and made this essay. And what then was the point of the essay? To have another publication? No. This is part of Ukraine's information war. I mean, because we know there are at least two wars going on. And so this was published first in 6,000 copies in English. And every member of the US Congress and Senate, the House of Commons, and select members of the House of Lords in London, all 800 members of the European Parliament got the English. And then we figured, well, most people, and certainly politicians, let's say in Italy, or even in Germany, they can't really read English well, so we figured, now we're going to put it out in various languages, and in the languages of countries that make a difference. So among the languages that this has been translated into,
Keep going.
Yeah.
So we also did it in Korean. The Japanese has already come out. We did it in Korean. Why in Korean? Well, that's because Korea is manufacturing a lot of arms. And it's not giving it directly to Ukraine because, you know, but so you address those countries that have some positive role to play in Ukraine's current struggle, but this is not for sale. You address the people who will be making these decisions and voting on appropriation bills. So, for us, very important is the German Bundestag. This came out in German 2 weeks ago. Every member of the Bundestag gets a copy of this with a personalized letter. They read it, they don't read it. Some of them will read it. Some of them will just look at the maps. And that's really all you need, right? You just look at the maps. Oh, Ukraine had a state way back in the 17th century. Oh, this place may be serious. Maybe we should give them some support. So it's part of a bigger picture. And then we did the Italian. You know why we did the Italian? Now, your Italian political leaders, maybe not the worst. Certainly they're not in the Orban category or Fico category. But also within this country, you have some little territory called the Vatican. And the head of the Vatican is problematic vis-a-vis the Ukraine.
We had a paper about that.
And all of his advisors are so we did the Italian edition because we have 90 addresses of all of the officials in the Vatican, which are getting within the next week the Italian edition. So this is what this is. This is not a book. And I wouldn't say, far be it for me to say this is a propaganda piece, but it is clearly part of the information war and our effort to do something on behalf of Ukraine.
My question is, have you addressed the calumny of Russia regarding Ukrainian Nazism, specifically Stepan Bandera, etc.? Because this is an obsession of Russian propaganda still, and it has been, unfortunately, widely received in this country. So in this country, people speak with a Roman jargon, Bandera nazista, as if it were something obvious. As just in the same way they say Israel apartheid, they say Bandera nazista, with the tone of voice of a Roman movie. And I think this should be addressed. I don't know to what extent it is an international problem, and not only Italian, but I think it's one of the issues that need to be addressed. Of course, the book by Serhii Plokhy, The Man with the
Gun, but it's a different story.
Whatever.
That's all about Bandera.
Is important. There is a PhD dissertation by a Polish guy whose name I cannot remember that deals with the whole Bandera, but is a little bit confusing. How about assessing Bandera as he was really? Is it for next effort?
Okay, so let me answer the question that way. First of all, my approach to matters as a scholar and what I write is not to, I can be criticized for this and have been, is not to address problems that are made problematic by polemicists. I'm not going to enter into a polemic with somebody. If I'm asked about Stepan Bandera, as I have been, or even in an earlier case with Jews, Simon Petliura during World War I, we're actually writing a biography of Simon Petliura, the first full-scale biography in English. I try not to address polemicists. I just try to state this is what is happening, or this is what was. Because if you start to react to somebody, you're going to go down into this kind of rabbit's hole. It can go on and on and on. Because at one level, I don't care what people who polemicize and hardly know anything about the subject, who cares about them? If you polemicize with them, you're legitimizing them. So, one way to answer your question, and also, who's going to read a lot? There's too many words. This one's terrible, a lot of words. People don't read anymore. Even scholars are having a problem reading books. So if you want the gist of this book, Jews and Ukrainians, it's actually, the whole book is in 2 pages. And it says, it's literally 2 pages, which is the last thing we did in the book. 10 examples of stereotypes, misperceptions, and competing stories. So, I'll just give you one example. The first one says, and then it's 2 columns, Jews and Ukrainians. So, chmiel, which of course is always used dismissively for Khmelnytsky. It's the Polish form, and that's what Hanover and other Jewish chronicles use. Chmiel, and in Jewish press, chmiel. Chmiel, may his name be erased, instigated the first genocidal catastrophe in the modern history of Jews. The Ukrainian side. Bogdan Khmelnytsky, our valiant Cossack leader, is a national liberator, defender of the Orthodox Christian faith, and creator of the first Ukrainian state in modern times. Okay, you want to know more? Then you read. But the point is, you got all the stereotypes. I don't know, did we do Bandera here? Maybe Bandera is here. Holocaust is here, and obviously Schwarzbard and Petlura. So, point is, yeah, these people are mentioned, but we're not taking on defending one or the other. Because that's not, at least that's not my style.
Okay, no, I agree completely, sorry. There must have been a misunderstanding. I agree completely with your approach. Okay. Your approach is the scholarly approach. However, how do we react to the people who in the media and elsewhere echo the Russian watchwords vis-a-vis the public who is ignorant? We need to give an alternative narrative.
Yes. Well, I guess your only alternative is to write editorial pieces or letters or whatever in which you just state, and in fact, in which you're not responding to anything, you're just, you know, like an article got the title, who really was Stepan Bandera? Right? And then you got 2-page essay on who he was, where he was, and so forth and so on. Or any other problematic thing. So that would be the way to do it. And of course, that is necessary. You have a conference of a small group of Ukrainianists. If you're not going to do it, who's going to do it? And that is part of what you should be doing, I would argue, as your moral responsibility as intellectuals. If you study a subject, your responsibility is to share knowledge about that subject to the society in which you live. And not by writing monographs, and not by writing articles in collections of essays that no one's going to read other than 50 people. And eventually, if you really want to make a difference, if you really want to make a difference in any society in which you live, you've got to get yourself in the business of writing school textbooks. Because that's where you change people's minds and attitudes, not anywhere else. Everyone's perception of the world is with between 12 and 16 in high school. You should be looking at the texts of world history or European history used in Italian schools and making sure that no more reference to Peter the Great or Catherine the Great. It was Peter the First and Catherine the Second, and we can go on and on and on with such kinds of examples. That's where the battle is.
I think that one aspect doesn't exclude the other, but I fully agree with you. The thing is that as soon as the war began, Italian journalists, or in generally speaking, or Italian mass media didn't give the opportunity to many experts and the Ukrainian studies to express themselves. It was very difficult. Very few Ukrainians had the opportunity to speak out their mind about culture, history, and all the problematic you're talking about now.
Question.
Yeah.
Did I understand?
The journalists have power, and they decide who has to speak.
Well, of course, of course. I mean, they're writing their articles and they're doing it, of course. But did I understand you to say that Ukrainianists were given the opportunity by Italian journalists, or were not? Were not. Yeah. Well, then you have to be pushy and aggressive. Let me tell you, until 1991, at least until 1991, in the United States, Ukraine did not exist. If you mention something, oh, I'm a Ukrainian background, and then automatic, oh, you're Russian. Literally did not exist. However, the Ukrainian diaspora carried on a non-ending campaign to make their point. And they still didn't get through. Then, of course, you got a state. But they still had to work hard at it. Right? It's still part of Russia, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, it is a long battle. You have to keep pushing. But it is your responsibility to do that. And it's not easy. And you're going to be rejected.
Well, I tried in my...
And of course, the best thing is if you get engaged in a polemic and someone says this person doesn't know what they're talking about, well, then you got them. Then you can play. But just to get your foot in the media door is already a challenge. And it has to be in the media door in which, when you get in the media door, you speak in short phrases. Don't be a professor. Kiss of death.
Well, I do agree with you. I also have to add...
He's good, by the way. He's good.
Thank you very much. But, I mean, I don't think
model.
I don't think you watch me on TV. But I think that many of us...
Have you been on TV?
Many times, of course.
Okay,
but
fine.
as many other associates of our association have been asked to explain Ukrainian topics to the public, either on newspapers or on TV, on radio. I think that, I mean, we have done what we were able to do, and I think that all of us, in a way, revolutionized their order of priorities. I mean, when the war started, because we, of course, had the civic duty that was towards the topic of our, let's say, mission as scholars for many decades, also to contributing to the fact that this topic is still existing and it's not destroyed by the war. So I think that we did what we were able to do. Perhaps we could have been more pushy, but I think that somehow it could be even counterproductive. And also, I mean, I was thinking of the implications of explicitly writing or talking about topics in the, let's say, as you were saying earlier, I mean, you always need to address the topics without becoming just another guests to TV shows that is called more for making show than actually informing people. So
right.
I think that we had a good political line of just trying to keep like it very professional in explaining what Ukraine is and what was going on but Giovanna perhaps would like to.
There is a problem with business because Italian economics were strictly bound to Russia. And these are very pushy and strong lobbies, and it's very difficult to break public opinion, television on that point. I think that this is one of the main problems, that Italian economy has many links with Russian.
Yes,
So there are still many fabrics and many enterprises working with Russia, so it's very hard to make war against this kind
right.
of.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not being facetious in asking this question. I'm quite serious, but I probably know the answer. None of you sitting in this room or anybody who has some sympathy to Ukraine have any relatives that are in the business world?
No,
but this is...
It would be important.
Well, exactly, because why are we so successful in North America and in Canada? Well, we do have diasporan oligarchs who pay for things,
in
and
Italy,
this does make a difference.
In Italy, the Ukrainian diaspora is very young and very poor.
Yeah, well, of course, I got it. But you're not young and poor. Well, you're my age, so I can speak with you like this. No, but the point is are you not born and raised in Italy?
I'm raised in Italy, yes.
Yeah. Well, so you're fully Italian. So you've been in this society for a while. You're not a new immigrant, is my point.
What are the last words?
You're not a new immigrant because you were saying
I'm
that
not,
most
I'm
Ukrainians.
not, but
Yeah,
we
precisely.
have no support from an educated old immigration. I mean,
Yeah, no, of course, I understand that. But you may have some of you may be able to convince some Italian who is not of Ukrainian background. You don't necessarily have to be of Ukrainian background to give support to a cause.
We are trying to do it, but it's very hard.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is.
Just to make an example, I think that it was much easier to get on the on TV and radio shows by the Switzerland Italian service than on the Italian TV, because I've been there very often. Because they use Italian and they were like more interested in actually getting to know some experts of Ukrainian studies than the Italian, let's say,
that was the point
media.
I was trying to make. Well, fortunately, Italian historians, although not everyone was working on Eastern Europe or Ukraine in particular, but they had the opportunity to express themselves. Sometimes they had no idea about Ukraine, but still I wouldn't mention their names, but probably I will do privately later. However, I mean, my little thing, I also wrote about Ukrainian in different internet articles, but the point I was trying to make is exactly what Professor Brogi was trying to tell you earlier on. It's difficult to break through at the big mass media or talk show where they speak about Ukraine, Russia just because they heard about it, or they invite even people from the diaspora who until yesterday didn't know a very grand idea about their own country or state. That's the thing, you know.
Well, yes. So
I'm very sorry, but they tell me
telling us to shut the doors, or not to get out of
Friday,
here.
probably.
okay, yeah. So we have to wrap it up, and
Yes.
Yes, I will wrap it up. Well, I wanted to end on a positive note, because we were going to say that nobody is going to read this book too many pages. Well, I do think this book is an extraordinary book. Just to build some suspense, for example, if you think of Babi Yar, think of the fact that people were killed there for 3 days. So if you think that perhaps the first day is not like known what is going on, but from the second day on, it's problematic. Why Jews are keeping on and going there and be killed? Of course, this is an historical problem. So there is an essay here by, for example, Karl Berkhoff that actually raises this problem. So if you want to know the answer, creating suspense, I'm not telling you how the problem is solved, but read this, because this is really an extraordinary book with the best scholarship available on this topic. And the other two books perhaps are less scholarly, so this is a scholarship reading other scholars, but still I think that they have an audience, and we will find more audience for the booklet for the Ukrainian readers. So thank you very much. Please join me with an applause. Thank you.